Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Bangladesh in Crisis, our series in which we've been looking in depth at the situation in Bangladesh. On tonight's programme, we're speaking about the International Crimes Tribunal, and joining me to discuss this is Toby Cadman, a human rights lawyer, and also from the rights group Justice Concern, Assad Zaman Fuad. Thank you for joining us and welcome to you both. Before we go into our main discussion about the trial in absentia, which is going to be starting in about 2 weeks' time in the case of Chowdhury Muinuddin, a British citizen, let's go through some newspapers and some news articles that we've got, and you guys have them in front of you. We'll start with the story about President Obama of the United States suspending trade privileges with Bangladesh. Toby, what can you tell us about this?
Well, I've obviously learned of this only within the last 24 hours. It is very worrying, but it is expected that the US would take such a position. You can see from this news report statements by members of the US government that they're very concerned that no steps have really been taken. And this is a drastic measure, but hopefully this will send a warning to the government of Bangladesh that they are going to have to improve.
It says here that American officials have offered Bangladesh a roadmap for steps that it needs to take to have these trade privileges restored. What can we expect to see in this roadmap?
Well, I can only say this is not a matter that I'm directly involved in, but obviously in my discussions with members of the US government on issues related to Bangladesh, this obviously has come up. What I would imagine that is being proposed, because the US government obviously recognises that the government of Bangladesh potentially doesn't have the money to fund all of these changes, that there will be a system of assistance to the government of Bangladesh to implement what they consider as broad labour reforms. I would hope that they will also be dealing with Professor Muhammad Yunus as well, because he's been making this call for internationally recognised minimum wage and standards to be applied. So one would hope that this roadmap will set out a path for the future, recognising that the government only has a limited period of time before the elections. This is likely to be an election issue, but one would hope that the government will already start to implement some of these changes. They would look to be preventing the factory fire and building collapses in the future. These are not necessarily difficult steps for them to implement.
So but quite easy stuff that you're saying? Well,
I would hope so, yes. But it is also ensuring that standards are being applied, not just amending the laws because they've already made some amendments, but they've got to ensure that these are actually properly implemented.
Good. Fuad, let's bring you in here. Justice Concern, that's the group you're from. This is probably something you're concerned about. How likely are we to see any real change from Bangladesh?
Well, before the suspension, there were some politics in it. American government has been pushing for a TICFA, Trade and Investment Framework Agreement, with Bangladesh for a number of years, which has been outstanding with the Cabinet Office in Bangladesh. And America has been trying to get the government on board. And perhaps for you viewers, there are over 128 countries in the world that America got the Trade and Investment Framework Agreement, but Bangladesh hasn't signed up to it yet. And the government, the last government and the present government has been refusing to sign it so far. So although I agree what has been written with regard to the government's collapse and what my learned friend had said, but of course there are a lot more of politics behind this push. With regard to the GSP preference, it has been, it's not working in fact for the last 2 years, but it did not affect the business in Bangladesh. Export has been rising year after year.
One of my next questions is how will this affect everyday people? Does it have any effect on...
Not really, because the total garments export, the GSP is less than 1% of the total business. It's not going to affect much. But of course, what it is, perhaps the relationship between the USA and Bangladesh has already been restrained, as my learned friend said about the Dr. Yunus things. So it's a kind of pressure that what's going on in Bangladesh, rather affecting the business. And also, I think this is not the right way to push for the health and safety things in the business. What we have seen the European Union taking the right steps, helping the business communities is basically promised over £50 million over the next few years to implement in the garment sector, so to improve the conditions of the work and the labourers.
But this decision that the US has taken has some implications for Europe as well, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, this is one of the things which is being discussed now, is to what extent the European Union and the United Kingdom is going to be re-evaluating their own trade agreements with Bangladesh because of this decision. I agree with what Fuad has said, that it doesn't necessarily have a huge impact on the market itself in Bangladesh, because a lot of what we're talking about is the ready-made garment industry that falls outside of this agreement. But first of all, it's a very symbolic decision by the United States that has provided Bangladesh a great deal of support over the last 2 years. But it could well have a knock-on effect. And if the European Union and the United Kingdom and other countries start to review their own trade agreements with Bangladesh, that would have an impact. Now, I, for one, would not like to see individuals in Bangladesh, and particularly those that already face very, very harsh conditions working in this industry, being affected by this. And I hope it does serve as a wake-up call to the government to actually do something. But as Fuad has said, there has been plenty of opportunity to make some real change, and it's lacking. This may well prompt some change. I think the message it does send, even if it doesn't have direct impact on the industry itself, it shows that the relationship between the US and Bangladesh is not set in stone.
Well, let's move on to another article. This is from The Australian. It's about 9 people who have been jailed in Bangladesh for the murder of a reporter. And they're described as 9 junior opposition politicians who are part of the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, that's the main opposition party, who have been convicted and jailed for killing a 33-year-old journalist after he exposed some corruption cases. Apparently, this is the first time a court has successfully tried a murder case for a journalist. Is that a big step, Fuad?
Not really, because there are politics and everything in Bangladesh. When you walk on the street and if there is a traffic jam, people discuss as whether there's something wrong with the BNP, why there is a long queue on the road. If you look the origin of this journalist, he is from Faridpur. Is the region of the Prime Minister's home, Faridpur, Gopalganj, and that region basically dominates the whole of the country these days, whether it be police force, military force, civil service. So it has a very huge political implications because that also helps the Prime Minister to bring out the corruptions of the previous government, while forgetting that almost 24, I think if I'm not wrong, 24 journalists have been killed in the last 4 years. Almost 19,000 people have been murdered in different places for different reasons in the last 4.5 years.
And you're saying there hasn't been a case?
Yes, and of course there are many journalists in the prison. Perhaps, your program had discussed about the Ahmad Dash, the second highest circulated newspaper's editor is in prison, has been tortured, and nothing has been going on. And of course this news isn't a big news in Bangladesh anyway. So
well, the article also says that
it's a good one, but of course we cannot be quite optimistic about the whole system as how it's going on.
The article also mentions that a 10th member of the accused died during the trial. What does that say about the way Bangladesh treats its detained persons?
Well, I'll disagree slightly with Fuad when everything that happens in Bangladesh is tainted by politics, unfortunately. But looking at this from a purely legal perspective, I think it is very important that a trial has been heard and that a number of individuals have been convicted for the murder of a journalist. And if the case as it's been presented is accurate, then they should have been tried for this and convicted. Because it is a horrific incident, strangling of a journalist for exposing corruption, irrespective of whether it's exposing the corruption of any of the political parties. But what is particularly worrying, as you say, is that one of those of the 10 died during the trial, potentially died in police custody. And this does highlight a particular problem in Bangladesh that we have been talking about for months on end, of widespread and systematic torture and death in police custody. As some of the listeners may know, we recently requested from the United Nations that a delegation is sent to Bangladesh to look at this as one of many issues.
People you're talking about in the ICT, but we'll come back to this. But just before we do, we'll come back and discuss the case of Chowdhury Muinuddin, the British citizen who's been tried in absentia in Bangladesh in about 2 weeks' time. But first, this report from Yasmin Khatoon about that trial.
Indicted by the Bangladeshi courts, it has now been announced that both Chowdhury Muinuddin and Ashraful Zaman will be tried by absentia. Justice Ubaidul Hassan of Bangladesh's International Crimes Tribunal gave the verdict ordering trials to commence from July 15th. Chowdhury Muinuddin resides in Britain and Ashraful Zaman in the US. Both men were ordered to appear before the courts earlier this year, but neither responded. At the time, Sanaul Haq, the Inspector General of Bangladesh's National Police Force, coordinating the ICT investigation, said, "As soon as the charges are made, which I can guarantee will happen in days, we will request the British government to hand him back to Bangladesh, and we will ask Interpol for his arrest. We will use all means, diplomatic and legal, to bring him back. If we fail, we will try him by absentia." Muinuddin in London and Ashraful Zaman in New York have been charged on 11 counts related to the massacre of the last days of the 1971 Liberation War. They are alleged to have led the Al-Badr leaders that were tasked by the Pakistani military junta. To be tried in absentia means that a trial takes place without the accused being present or in the custody of the tribunal. The rationale being that justice must not be thwarted by the will of the accused or the intent of a state which refuses to hand over any defendant. The absent accused must be represented by a defence counsel before the tribunal, and in this case the Bangladeshi courts have appointed advocates on behalf of those accused. The International Crimes Tribunal has been accused of neglecting the rights of those being tried, and over the last 2 years various human rights organisations have shown their displeasure towards much of the procedure. Flawed is just one word being used. As the tribunal continues and the international community become engaged, the next 2 weeks will open up a new phase to the ICT and as to how it will be going forward. Yasmin Khatoon, reporting for Islam Channel, Bangladesh in Crisis.